I'm making this tape the day after my 65th birthday. The reason I'm making this tape is because detractors in the government that I have long resisted don't want me making this tape, and as a result, they've paralyzed me with Parkinson's. So I'm slowed down. What I'm doing with my time is to teach people who are acquainted with me how to find the material evidence for my research among my belongings. I'm sure that the tapes I've made are seen by only a few, but if somebody ever realizes their importance, they will be very helpful. There's too many of them, I realize that too, but that's the cost of making do with limited ability. I've been very disabled by the situation. And as you know, there's long been some tension in our society between the religious community, the parochial school people, and the public school people, the people who are secular humanists. Well, in the old medieval theology, they would burn people with a stake and torture them to death. And I was across the street after my father's divorce from my mother, and he was a humanist from a parochial gang led by Richard Carle. And they have tortured me. And what we're dealing with in the situation, the horrific situation in Gaza, is relevant because the theologians on both sides are responsible for making a forcing house out of their collective ideology of right-wing religious violence. Now, I don't want to talk so much about that as I want to talk about the third mirror. To understand the theological assignment of the right-wing extremists who hallucinate from the Old Testament and bang the table and claim it's law, you look at War for the World by Major General Thawes Lane. He talks about the peace of the flesh being in opposition to the peace of the spirit. And the peace of the spirit only comes through combat. And he likened the fallacy of peace of the spirit to the government of JFK, who they shot down. The idea that you should torture somebody to death for not believing is old and dark theology. But it also has come to roost in modern times, as exemplified by my condition and situation and the lack of intervention regarding this situation, which is very sad and terrifying as it escalates across the planet. So, where does that leave my research? I want to talk about the first mirror a little bit just to remind you of what it contains. It's a Cain and Abel story. The mirror of reality is the Zapruder film where JFK is seen being gunned down. The mirror itself, it's textually a metaphor from Hitler's cinema, a metaphor for cinema itself. The mirror is used as a metaphor for cinema itself. So the mirror of the Zapruder film is told in the dimension of Axis victory by the films Cruel Gun Story and Killers, which mirrors Zapruder film, one of which stars Ronald Reagan, which shows his hand in this Cain and Abel story. So the second mirror we know from examining how it was transferred to me as a little boy from Bush's ship in the Navy, a pun on the bomb, the little boy bomb. And they sent the text to me. We know from the text itself that they played Two Virgins Pussy Ball, which was clocked to the AIDS attack. if you look at what Donald Trump is doing this very moment, he's tearing down the historical foundations of the White House to build a ballroom. It is very interesting that the movie Shall We Dance, based on ballroom dancing, which emerged at the tail end of the Pussy Ball conflict, clocked to 119 minutes. There's another film called 119, which is a mirror of the 911 attack. And professionals surely know this. It was very conspicuous. But the third mirror, we haven't made much progress on. The third mirror we haven't made much progress on, not so much because of the research not being done, the research is being done, but because the mindfulness to juggle the issues and present them intelligibly has been lost in the more important work of Mirror 1 and Mirror 2. Let's turn today to Mirror 3. I call your attention to this page from the script from 1974. It's conspicuous because it contains all three mirrors. It mentions the murder of Martin Luther King, and that's why so much attention is paid to this letter. It explains why they killed King over virginity. And Mirror 2, of course, is the Virgin War game, Two Virgins Pussy Ball, that was clocked to the AIDS attack, which is in this roster of people from the Neva Pornographic Corporation and the Manson Cinema Corporation, who are delineated by Neva Mancine in the script. Well, if you look at the top, it says, I say is, not was. She says, today is a freaky day. I say is, not was. And down here, she talks about God must be watching over me. I want to make sure that that registers so that you can see the problem of the third mirror. Would you hand me that Lazarus book? Okay. This is from the priest Franklin Graham, who swore in Don Toon, or gave him the blessing when for his second crusade. It's from his book, Worth Fighting For, Rebel with a Cause, or some hackneyed phrase like that. Said every Contra had a nickname. So if he or she were ever caught by the Sandinistas, real names wouldn't be disclosed. One man I had in the chaplain's course was called Hitler. He had been an executioner for the Contra army. Apparently his cohorts had chosen his name well, because at one time Hitler had been very proficient at his responsibilities. Now, I want to remind you that chaplain, it means you're studying to be a man of the cross. Hitler's salvation in this, Hitler was one of our promising young chaplains. And after he came to Christ, he excelled in every area and soon became the head chaplain. One of his assignments was to give the announcements following each lecture. One day, as Reuben, it's important, that name, and it's to be footnoted in future research why it's important, that name. One day, as Reuben was finishing up, he said, now Hitler will come and give us our announcements. Hitler stood up before his friends. In Spanish, he said to Reuben, my name no Hitler. That's fine, Reuben said, but we didn't give his change of name much thought. The next day, don't give any thought to it. No, don't. When you hear his name is changed to, no, don't give any thought to it. Sorry for interrupting. The next day, Reuben announced again, Hitler going to, no, no more Hitler, no, no. That no longer my name. Well, said Reuben, I've been calling you Hitler for the past several months. If you're no longer Hitler, then what is your name? Lazarus, he said with a smile. Call me Lazarus because I have been raised from the dead. So Hitler has been raised from the dead. Okay, where this leads when you say is not was, the idea of the spirit being incarnated. In fact, this crowd rescued physically Adolf Hitler and stowed him away. I say is not was, and I think God must be watching over me up here in the script that contains all three mirrors. This page contains all three mirrors. Would you hand me the Ouspensky Superman book? I want to tell you where this leads in the history of what is going on in the dark in Axis cinema for real internationally, because it sheds light on what's been happening under the partnership of Putin and Trump, which is a personalization of politics. It's just a couple of tyrants playing cat and mouse with the ideals of our society while they stow away the power system. And it goes back to 1920s. Ouspensky's, it says, fourth dimensional Superman. Ouspensky was a fourth dimensional psychologist. Now, would you hand me the other book about Ouspensky? I want to show you what I found researching his influence over cinema. It's very important and interesting to learn that the Hollywood cinema moguls got off the ground in the same place as the era of the great dictators. It was a place called Fayum. What do I mean that they got off the ground? It's where D.W. Griffith met with Mussolini because they had a hero in common and a mentor in common named Gabriele D'Annunzio. Gabriele D'Annunzio was an Italian aviator in the First World War, but he was also a poet. His name is the first name mentioned in the credits of the film that most inspired D.W. Griffith's epic cinema. D.W. Griffith made the Burning Cross for the KKK in a film, The Birth of a Nation. That's the first time it was ever used in conjunction with the KKK. It was pulled from the mirror of his movie and put to work in the South of America for domestic terror purposes. These people made the Second World War film, Dangerous Journey, with Errol Flynn, who was meeting with Hitler, that has Reagan sitting next to a bust of Hitler with the U.S. over the swastika. And it says, rather us, which is like Lazarus back from the dead. Who lived in Laurel Canyon with Errol Flynn was Harry Houdini. So if you look at the situation in the Matrix, you see that they trace back to Gabriele D'Annunzio. Gabriele D'Annunzio was in a place called Fayum, which was a contested sovereignty region in Habsburg, Croatia, and Italy were claiming it. It was notorious because all three sides vying for power were counterfeiting to boost their prestige and standing economically. So the era of the great dictators and Hollywood studio system got off the ground simultaneously in a counterfeiting den. Now, the idea of the Italian futurists, Marinetti, Luigi Freddi, who were acolytes of D'Annunzio also, was that if you could control the future, they wrote something called the Italian Futurist Manifesto, which influenced Mussolini and was considered one of the first documents of the fascist movement. If you could reach into the future and control media, you could control the world. Well, this idea then settled into a macabre power system that was manipulating people's perceptions of reality through media. If you look at D.W. Griffith and Reagan's film from World War II, what you see is an arc of time, virtually a century. Paul Robeson's career spanned it. After the Civil War, the defeated reasserted their power through Hollywood with the film The Birth of the Nation, glorifying the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. After World War II, the defeated reasserted their power through the Red Scare machine of Hollywood. And these were the exact same men. These were the same exact men. Raoul Walsh, who made Reagan's wartime film, was the assistant director to D.W. Griffith on the birth of the nation. In fact, he played Jefferson Davis in that film, or John Wilkes Booth. I can't remember which one of the anti-heroes. What you find in fourth dimensional psychology of Ouspensky and the Superman of Ouspensky is a newspaper called the New Age newspaper from 1919, in which they discuss Fayum and people like D'Annunzio and Gurdjieff. And Ouspensky has something in here called Letters from Russia. And when I turned to some of the other articles, I found, to my amazement, an epistle on a religious concept to be controlled through Hollywood, which, by the way, King Edward, a friend of Adolf Hitler of England, came to the New York City in 1920 and declared that Hollywood should be controlled by the British Church of England. In fact, the notorious Alan Dulles put the biblicist Cecil B. DeMille in charge of Radio Free Europe after World War II. But what it has is a reference to a super production of apocalyptic nature. So what they did was they synthesized this idea of deceiving people to believe that they understood what was happening. And Hitler was forgiven by Jesus and arose from the dead. And who was his spiritual familiar? That we understand from the system around Scorsese and Peter Gabriel and the Jeffin Corporation put together the Two Virgins Pussyball game and authored a headhunt about me. Yoko Ono's attorney, Amanda Harcourt, said, I can't help with a publisher because it was all luck. I was sticking my neck out. It's a reference to John Lennon's album Milk and Honey, where he's sticking his neck out and kissing Yoko Ono on the cheek. It's full of these sublime symbols that make John Lennon the sublime imagist. And Two Virgins was his idea. John Lennon pulled a Houdini. And they set into the script the iron law of the idea that I would be blamed for his death. So the little boy is to blame for the death of the Axis leadership. And the feudal politics of Pussyball, the killing of people who represented tokens as barriers of blood, comes from Yoko Ono's revenge of a cultural direction. You're supposed to worship John Lennon's advocacy for the feudalism of Japan. Now, would you hand me this last book? Yeah, I need to see what it is. What you have here are some images of I say is not was. Direction. For example, Alan Dulles was a friend of Ian Fleming, who made the film You Only Live Twice. And there are frames from a large number of different movies with the same pattern in them. Here's John Lennon's last song in a film from the 50s with a woman who looks like the author of the script. Notice the Neva Corporation woman. They're both cupping their hands over their ears like from a thunderclap, and it says it will be just like starting over. Why is she on the cover of a record, Gail Burson, the author of the Israeli script, of Robert Fripp in 1979, if she helped kill John Lennon in 1980? They're not about to try to explain it. They refuse to answer the question. Why did they arrest me, who they admit knew nothing about it, when they didn't arrest her? And what is she doing playing violin in a mural in Seattle Center? There's a assortment of images. This is from Mannix. He's fully alive and he has something over his face to hide his identity. He says, I would like you to find out who killed me. How clever. This is from, you know how John Lennon liked to be number one. This is from Number One Kung Fu. We'll know you're alive. This is from a film noir movie from Britain, I believe, or Hollywood. They might guess what? I'm not a corpse after all. Here's another movie with Ingmar Bergman called The Arch of Triumph. after World War II. It's black and white. He did see you. He thinks I'm dead. And there it is in the script again. I say is, not was. Mirror 3 is the synthesis of John Lennon with Hitler's power structure, both of whom survived, to create an invisible fourth dimensional dictatorship acting in impingements on our lives and through media. A man-made God, a fourth dimensional Ouspensky Superman. And that is what Gail Burson is referring to when she says, I think God must be watching over me. What is she talking about when she says she thinks God must be watching over me? The murder of Martin Luther King, which these horrible morons, imagining themselves saintly, considered to be an execution in the name of virginity.